He walked into prison as a 22-year-old kid and walked out 33 years later as a man the world tried to erase. No DNA, no motive, no reason to suspect him. Just a rushed investigation, a broken system, and the wrong man who paid the price. For more than 3 decades, Daniel Saldana woke up in a concrete box, fighting to prove what he had screamed since day one. I did not shoot anyone. And when the truth finally surfaced, it exposed a lie so massive, so reckless. The state of California was forced to pay nearly $19 million for the years they stole. This is not just a wrongful conviction. This is the story of how an innocent man survived the impossible and returned home to reclaim the life they tried to bury. Before we begin, hit like, tap subscribe, and turn on notifications. Every click helps expose wrongful convictions, supports real cases, and gives a voice to people the system tried to silence. This is Innocence Uncovered, exposing injustice, uncovering truth, one story at a time. Daniel Saldana was 22 years old, just 22. He was a son, a brother, a friend, a young man with ordinary dreams and an extraordinary capacity for hope. He wanted a steady job, a place to call home, a life where laughter filled the rooms he walked into. He grew up in Baldwin Park, California, a city of quiet streets, corner stores, and tight-knit neighborhoods where neighbors looked out for one another. Daniel knew everyone by name. He knew which taco stand served the best food, which gas station clerk always had a smile, and which park offered the coolest shade on a hot afternoon. Daniel loved football. The game energized him, the camaraderie with teammates, the thrill of cheering fans on Friday nights. He loved his friends, the simple joy of conversation, joking, planning for the future. His dreams were modest but meaningful. College someday, maybe a small home of his own, the possibility of building a life he could be proud of. He wasn't rich, he wasn't powerful, but he was happy, and most importantly, he was free. Then came 1989. It was a night like any other, buzzing with energy after a high school football game. The streets were alive with teenagers, parents keeping a watchful eye, the quiet hum of community life. And then, in an instant, everything changed. Shots rang out in a drive-by attack near the stadium, leaving 2 students injured. Panic spread through Baldwin Park like wildfire. Fear settled in every household, in every stomach, in every mind. Authorities scrambled for answers. The city demanded justice. The police needed someone to hold accountable. In the chaos, the search for a suspect became urgent. And in that frenzy, Daniel Saldana was identified as the man to blame. There was no DNA, no credible evidence, no motive linking him to the crime. Nothing, except the insistence of authorities and the pressure applied to witnesses. According to later court records, testimonies were manipulated, statements were coerced, and the truth was buried beneath layers of fabrication. Daniel had not committed the crime. But at that moment, his life was no longer his own. The knock on his door came early one morning. Uniformed officers stood outside, badges gleaming, faces unreadable. They told him he was under arrest. Daniel's mind raced. Confusion, disbelief, and terror collided. He could not understand how his ordinary life had led to this. Questions flooded his thoughts. Why me? How could this happen? He was taken from his home, guided into a car that smelled of leather and authority. He looked back once, at the place that had always been his sanctuary, unsure if he would ever see it again. Inside, fear and uncertainty churned alongside a fragile hope that somehow, someone would see the truth. Even in those first hours, Daniel felt the crushing weight of being presumed guilty. No one asked him to explain, no one listened. The machinery of accusation moved swiftly, with little regard for innocence or humanity. A young man who had spent his life dreaming and laughing suddenly found himself trapped in a reality he could not fathom. He did not yet know what lay ahead. He did not yet know the decades of hardship, the isolation, the struggle to maintain his identity behind bars. All he knew was that the world had turned against him, and his life, once ordinary and full of promise, had been ripped from his hands. In that moment, Daniel clung to one thought: the truth. It was fragile, it was distant, and it was his only weapon. He resolved, even in fear, that he would not let the world define him falsely. The day the police came for Daniel, his life fractured in an instant. It was early morning when uniformed officers knocked at his door, their badges glinting, their expressions unreadable. They told him he was under arrest. At first, he thought it was a mistake, a misunderstanding. Someone had confused him with someone else. But the officers were insistent. They didn't ask for explanations, they demanded compliance. Daniel was taken to a police station, handcuffed, and led into an interrogation room. It was stark, cold, and unforgiving. For hours, he was questioned, pressured, and told to confess to something he had never done. The detective, a man later revealed to have a history of manipulating cases, leaned close, insisting that Daniel would be better off if he admitted guilt. But Daniel could not lie about something he had not done. He repeated the truth again and again: "I did not shoot anyone." Meanwhile, investigators were building a case that would become the foundation of his conviction. Witnesses were approached multiple times, sometimes coached, sometimes threatened, until their statements aligned with the narrative the police wanted. Evidence that contradicted Daniel's presence at the scene was ignored. Details that suggested someone else could have been responsible were buried. By the time Daniel's trial began, the system had already decided his fate. The courtroom was intimidating. The prosecutor, confident and unyielding, presented the case with precision. Witnesses testified, some faltering, some pressured, their words molded into support for the prosecution. Daniel sat in the defendant's chair, bewildered, watching as his life was dissected, analyzed, and condemned. He tried to speak, to protest, but the words felt powerless against the machinery of the law that was spinning toward a verdict. Days turned into weeks. The trial was a blur of legal jargon, objections, and the relentless march of courtroom procedure. Daniel's lawyers worked tirelessly, but even they could not fully counter the weight of false testimony and manipulated evidence. Every motion filed, every objection raised, seemed to hit a wall of resistance. It was as if the system itself was determined to see him punished, regardless of truth. Then came the verdict. Guilty. Attempted murder. The sentence, 45 years to life. At 22, Daniel's future was erased in a single moment. He was led away, shackled, his heart heavy with disbelief, anger, and fear. The man who had dreamed of a normal life was now a prisoner of a system that had failed him utterly. The emotional toll was immediate and devastating. His parents clutched each other in disbelief, tears flowing freely. His siblings were left with a void where a brother should have been. Friends could not reconcile the image of the young man they knew with the criminal labeled in the papers. And Daniel, he had to make sense of a world that had branded him guilty for a crime he did not commit. Inside, the reality of prison life began in full. He was processed, photographed, and assigned a cell. The walls felt taller than he could have imagined. Guards were stern, inmates cautious and sometimes hostile. Every step he took reminded him that the freedom he had known was gone. The injustice of it all was suffocating. Yet Daniel did not give up. He began to document everything he could: conversations, events, inconsistencies in witness statements. He wrote letters to his family, to lawyers, to anyone who would listen. Each piece of paper, each word, was a lifeline, a reminder that he had not surrendered his voice. He began to learn the law in bits and pieces, absorbing it as a survival mechanism. Understanding the rules was the first step in preparing for a long, uphill fight. The conviction also cast a shadow over those who had believed in him. Some friends drifted away, unsure how to respond to the stigma of association. Family members became targets of gossip, whispers in the community questioning their judgment or loyalty. Every phone call from home carried the double weight of love and despair, a reminder that his imprisonment affected not just him, but everyone who cared for him. Daniel faced not just the sentence of prison, but the psychological warfare of being treated as a criminal every single day. Officers who should have protected him often treated him with suspicion or disdain. Inmates, sensing vulnerability, tested him in ways he had never known in the outside world. Survival demanded constant vigilance, careful alliances, and a steel-like resolve to maintain his integrity amid an environment that rewarded deceit and punishment. Through all this, Daniel kept a small flame alive inside. He refused to admit guilt. He refused to let the false conviction define who he was. Every lie told against him became a challenge to endure and overcome. Each day he survived was a testament to his determination to prove that the system had gotten it wrong. The early years were the hardest. The isolation, the fear, the knowledge that life outside was moving on without him, it weighed on him. But these were also the years where resilience was forged. Daniel began to understand that proving his innocence would not be easy. It would require patience, endurance, and an unwavering belief in the truth. And so, at 22, Daniel Saldana became more than a man behind bars. He became a symbol of endurance, a quiet but unbroken soul determined to reclaim a life that had been stolen. What had started as a routine night in Baldwin Park had evolved into a decades-long struggle against injustice. Prison is not just walls and bars. Prison is time stretched thin. It is days that blend into months, months that become years, and years that erase the boundaries between yesterday and today. For Daniel Saldana, the sentence of 33 years felt like a life designed to grind the soul into dust. The first months were a shock. Every sound in the facility, the clang of metal doors, the shuffle of boots on concrete, the shouted orders of guards, reminded him that freedom was no longer his. Inmates measured each other with quiet, unspoken rules. A glance could provoke violence. A misstep could mark you as prey. Daniel quickly learned that survival demanded vigilance, observation, and restraint. A single word, a single gesture, could alter the course of a day or a life. Loneliness became a constant companion. Letters from home arrived sporadically, sometimes lost, sometimes delayed, sometimes arriving with news of birthdays celebrated without him, graduations he could not attend, marriages he could not witness. Each envelope was a bittersweet reminder. His life was on pause, while the world continued without him. He wrote back whenever he could, pouring thoughts on a paper, trying to maintain some connection to the life he once had. But the isolation was more than physical. It was emotional. Daniel had to navigate a world that assumed he was guilty, where every interaction was colored by suspicion. Officers treated him as a problem. Fellow inmates treated him as a commodity or a target, and the walls themselves seemed designed to strip away dignity. The concrete echoed with despair, and the routine of prison, a cycle of wake, eat, work, sleep, was unending. Days lost their meaning, marked only by the passage of meals, counts, and lockdowns. Yet, even in this darkness, Daniel found ways to endure. Reading became a refuge. Books offered escape, imagination, and knowledge. He studied law in scraps of time, learning the language and mechanics that might one day help him fight for justice. Writing became therapy and strategy. Letters to lawyers, detailed notes on every event, and journals where he poured grief, hope, and rage into words that no one might read for decades. Prison also taught him the fragility and resilience of human relationships. Some inmates became allies, sharing advice, protection, or small comforts. Others betrayed trust, reminding him that life inside demanded caution. Friendships were formed and lost, alliances built on necessity rather than trust, and the sense of community he had once known in Baldwin Park seemed like a distant memory. There were moments of despair, nights when he stared at the ceiling of his cell, imagining the life that could have been. Moments when the injustice of it all felt too heavy to bear. The world had moved on, and he remained frozen in time, unable to participate in anything beyond the concrete walls. Friends married, children were born, careers advanced, all while he existed in limbo. The weight of lost time pressed down, and the anger and grief were constant companions. But Daniel survived. Survival became an art, a skill honed day by day. He learned routines, how to avoid conflict, how to assert boundaries without attracting danger. He became adept at reading people, understanding the subtle hierarchies within the prison walls. Every small victory, a safe passage through a day, a kind word from a guard, a letter answered, was a reminder that he was still here, still resisting the system's attempt to erase him. As the years passed, he began to navigate the legal system from within. He filed appeals, wrote petitions, and sought out legal aid when possible. Each rejection was a blow, but each small win, each acknowledgement of procedural errors, renewed hope. He learned that freedom would not come easily, that the truth would not reveal itself without persistence, and that his voice, though marginalized, had to be used relentlessly. Daniel's family suffered alongside him. They grew older, their lives shadowed by worry and uncertainty. Visits became lifelines, brief moments of connection that reminded him he was not completely forgotten. Their love and support became his anchor, helping him cling to sanity and the idea that someday justice might prevail. He also witnessed the human cost of the system around him. Men who had committed crimes, men who were guilty, were sometimes treated better than he was. Those who were innocent, like him, endured the harshest punishment without recourse. He saw lives ruined, minds broken, and spirits crushed, and it strengthened his resolve. He refused to become one of the lost, the forgotten, the broken. Through decades of injustice, Daniel developed resilience, patience, and an unwavering commitment to the truth. He honed an inner strength that would sustain him long after the walls of prison were behind him. He understood that surviving was not just about living day to day. It was about preparing for the moment when the world would finally recognize what had been stolen from him. And he waited. 33 years of waiting, enduring, surviving, learning, growing, and hoping. 33 years of waking up every morning in a concrete box and refusing to surrender his identity, his dignity, or his truth. By the time the first cracks in his wrongful conviction began to appear, Daniel was no longer the 22-year-old who walked into prison. He was a man forged in adversity, tempered by injustice, and prepared to fight for a life the world had tried to erase. Decades of injustice do not vanish quietly. For Daniel Saldana, the truth had been waiting, buried beneath layers of false testimony, fabricated evidence, and bureaucratic indifference. And yet, it began to emerge, slowly, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, revealing what had been hidden for far too long. It began with a spark of possibility. A co-defendant, who had long been imprisoned for his role in the drive-by shooting, stepped forward to clarify the events of that night. He swore that Daniel had not been present, that the story the authorities had woven around him was false. For the first time in years, a crack appeared in the wall of lies that had confined him. The legal system, finally, could no longer ignore the inconsistencies that had been evident all along. Daniel's legal team pounced on this new evidence. They meticulously gathered witness recantations, cross-referenced statements, and built a case that exposed the reckless and intentional misconduct that had led to his wrongful conviction. Each document, each affidavit, became a tool of liberation, a step toward reclaiming a life that had been stolen. The process was grueling. Courts were slow, bureaucracies resistant, and every motion faced obstacles. Yet, Daniel's resolve never wavered. He had endured 33 years of imprisonment. He could endure legal delays and procedural hurdles. Every small victory, whether a judge granting a hearing or a witness admitting prior coercion, brought him closer to the moment he had dreamed of for more than 3 decades: freedom. The district attorney's office took notice. A conviction integrity unit, or the equivalent at the time, reviewed the files, examined the evidence, and scrutinized the detective's conduct. Investigators found troubling patterns: witness intimidation, fabrication of evidence, suppression of exculpatory testimony. It was not just a miscarriage of justice. It was an egregious abuse of power. For Daniel, the emotional weight of this process was immense. Every hearing reopened old wounds. Every courtroom session brought back memories of the trial that had condemned him. Yet there was also hope, fragile but growing, that the world might finally see what he had known all along. He was innocent. In May 2023, after decades of relentless legal struggle, a court officially declared Daniel Saldana factually innocent. The phrase, clinical and detached on paper, carried a magnitude of meaning that words cannot fully capture. It was an acknowledgement that the system had failed, that a man had been wronged, and that the truth, eventually, had prevailed. The moment he learned of his exoneration, Daniel felt an overwhelming mix of emotions. Relief, yes. Joy, but tempered by sorrow for the decades he had lost. Rage, but tempered by the knowledge that justice had finally recognized the truth. 33 years of his life had been stolen, and while no verdict could return those years, the acknowledgement of innocence was a critical step in reclaiming his identity. Daniel's family, who had endured alongside him, finally breathed a collective sigh of relief. The anguish that had shadowed them for decades was lifted, if only slightly. Parents who had feared for their son's survival, siblings who had grown up with a brother behind bars, friends who had doubted whether the truth would ever be seen. They could finally see the vindication that had seemed impossible for so long. The public began to take notice. Media coverage highlighted the egregious failures that led to his wrongful conviction. The detective who had coerced witnesses and fabricated evidence faced scrutiny, while legal analysts dissected the case as a glaring example of systemic misconduct. Daniel's story became a symbol, not just of personal survival, but of the urgent need for oversight, accountability, and reform in the criminal justice system. Emotionally, the exoneration was both cathartic and bittersweet. Daniel stepped out of the courtroom a free man, but he carried with him the invisible scars of decades behind bars. Simple pleasures, a walk in the sun, a conversation over coffee, a night spent in a bed without iron bars around him, were profound experiences. The world he returned to was not the one he had left. It had moved on, changed, and in many ways, left him behind. Yet, Daniel was determined to reclaim what was his. He had survived the impossible, endured the unconscionable, and emerged with his integrity intact. The exoneration was more than legal vindication. It was the restoration of a life stolen by deception, prejudice, and systemic failure. As news of his innocence spread, it sparked conversations across the state and the nation. Discussions about wrongful convictions, detective misconduct, and the need for robust review processes intensified. Daniel's story illuminated the human cost behind statistics and reports. The lost years, the emotional trauma, the families torn apart, the lives interrupted. For Daniel, every day after the exoneration was a step toward healing. He reconnected with family and friends, rebuilding relationships strained by time and distance. He sought therapy to process decades of trauma and developed routines to adapt to a world that had transformed while he was imprisoned. Each small achievement, a drive in a car, a meal shared with loved ones, a quiet evening in freedom, was a victory in itself. Yet the fight was not over. The exoneration was a legal triumph, but the scars of wrongful imprisonment do not vanish with a verdict. Daniel began to explore avenues for compensation, understanding that while money could never restore lost time, it could provide the means to rebuild his life with some semblance of security and dignity. The road from being declared factually innocent to living a life free from the shadows of the past was long, complicated, and fraught with challenges. But the truth had emerged. It was undeniable. And for Daniel Saldana, the man who had endured more than 3 decades of injustice, it was the moment when survival met vindication, a moment that would define the final chapters of a life almost erased. Freedom is not something that hits all at once. For Daniel Saldana, the moment the prison gates swung open did not instantly erase 33 years of confinement. It was not a cinematic liberation. It was tentative, fragile, filled with awe, disbelief, and the subtle tremor of a body that had learned to exist within walls. He stepped into sunlight that felt unfamiliar, almost harsh. The air smelled different, carried with it the sense of a world that had changed while he slept behind bars. Cars moved faster, phones glowed in everyone's hands, and the ordinary rhythms of life, once taken for granted, now seemed alien. Every step was a reminder. He had survived, but survival was only the beginning. Daniel's family, who had waited decades for this day, enveloped him in a mixture of tears, laughter, and silence. Words were insufficient. Embraces carried years of pain, love, and longing. Each hug was a testament to endurance and loyalty. Time had not diminished their bond, but it had deepened it, tempered it with the knowledge of what had been lost. The legal battles were not yet over. Alongside the emotional reunion came the question of compensation. 33 years of life stolen could never truly be repaid, but the court system, in acknowledgement of the egregious wrong, approved a settlement. On November 14, 2025, the city of Baldwin Park agreed to pay $19.1 million to Daniel Saldana. The settlement was more than money. It was a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing, a statement that the state had failed in its duty to protect an innocent man. It validated the years of suffering, the lost opportunities, the emotional and psychological trauma inflicted by a system that had placed convenience over truth. The settlement was a bridge, a means to rebuild a life that had been interrupted, an opportunity to reclaim agency over a future that had been denied. Yet Daniel's focus was not the dollar amount. He knew that no sum could bring back the birthdays, the graduations, or the relationships altered by time and distance. What mattered most was the recognition of truth and the chance to live life on his own terms. The money was a tool to facilitate that life, not the measure of it. Adjusting to the outside world was not easy. The world had changed drastically during his absence. Technology, culture, social norms, all were unfamiliar. Daniel approached each day with caution, curiosity, and determination. Small victories, buying groceries, navigating city streets, reading the news without restriction, became profound symbols of autonomy. Every interaction reminded him that he was no longer under the weight of wrongful incarceration. Therapy and support networks became essential. Daniel confronted the emotional scars of decades lost: anxiety, hypervigilance, anger, and grief. The stolen years left gaps that could never be fully repaired, but acknowledging them allowed him to rebuild. Each session, each conversation, each reflective moment became a brick in the foundation of a reclaimed life. Public attention followed him. Journalists and news outlets chronicled the settlement and his exoneration, highlighting not just the money, but the story of survival and resilience. Daniel chose to participate cautiously, aware that his story could inspire change, yet wanting to retain control over a life that had so long been dictated by others. He began to speak publicly, sharing his experience to illuminate the human cost of wrongful convictions. His story was no longer only about him. It became a voice for countless others trapped by a system that fails too often. He discussed the importance of oversight, accountability, and reform, advocating for systemic change to prevent others from enduring what he had. His narrative became a beacon of hope, a testament to endurance, and a call to justice. Daniel also focused on rebuilding his personal life. Relationships that had been paused by incarceration were nurtured, friendships revisited, and family bonds strengthened. He pursued simple joys, walking through a park, listening to music, savoring meals without restriction. Each experience was a reminder of life's ordinary miracles, previously denied to him. The settlement allowed him practical freedoms, the ability to secure housing, access healthcare, and establish financial independence. It was a lifeline enabling him to navigate a world that had been waiting for him. But it was the intangibles, the human connections, the regained autonomy, the ability to plan for a future that defined its true value. For Daniel, redemption was both public and private. Publicly, he was recognized as innocent, compensated for his suffering, and elevated as an example of resilience. Privately, he rebuilt a sense of self eroded by decades of unjust imprisonment. He learned to trust, to hope again, and to envision a life not constrained by walls, verdicts, or false accusations. Reflecting on his journey, Daniel understood the paradox of his existence. The world had tried to erase him, yet he had endured, resisted, and survived. 33 years of imprisonment could not extinguish his humanity, his dignity, or his capacity for hope. The settlement, the exoneration, the reunion with his family, they were affirmations that the truth had a way of asserting itself, even when delayed. And so, Daniel Saldana stepped forward into his reclaimed life. He was no longer the 22-year-old kid arrested on a false charge. He was a man who had survived the impossible, endured decades of injustice, and emerged with the strength to rebuild, the wisdom to educate, and the courage to advocate. He walked forward with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced the darkest possibilities and refused to be broken. The story of Daniel Saldana is not just about a settlement or a legal victory. It is about the resilience of the human spirit. It is about the costs of injustice and the power of endurance. It is about a man who survived the impossible and returned to a world that had changed, to a life he had every right to live, and to a future he was determined to shape on his own terms.